Here at the Independence Reformed Bible Church, we do allow for questions following the service. What we'll do this morning is, so we don't have our guys, Cameron and whoever, just kind of running around with the microphone. What we'll do this morning, trying something a little bit different. If you have a question, you can come up here and speak into the mic. That way we can get you on tape too, right, Dean? Oh, yeah. So. Oh, yeah. So yeah, if you have a question, come on up and do feel free to ask it. Don't be intimidated. Not intimidated.
I actually don't have a question or a comment. You were talking about dualism and you quoted that hymn, "This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through." That's actually a hymn that I grew up hearing sung in my home quite frequently, in my church quite frequently. And there was this attitude of we disassociate ourselves from the world because they're unclean, but they would fellowship with the compromised Christian. We don't want to cast them out entirely because, then, they might feel unloved and then we'd lose them. And so there was this flipped idea of the gospel not actually being efficacious. And I don't think they would have thought of it that way, but that was like the underlying idea of, whereas you go back to 1 Corinthians 5, and Paul says, I'm not telling you not to disassociate yourselves with the world. Like, you should, then you should associate with the world. Otherwise, you'd not be in it entirely. But you should disassociate yourself from those in the church, and you should judge those in the church who are in immorality. And this flipped idea denies the efficacy of the gospel. It denies that the gospel can redeem people. It denies that the gospel has a power outside in the heathen world. And it also denies that people in the church who have received the gospel will change. It sort of views them as these spiritual people that believe rightly, but they don't live rightly, because it separates what they believe from what they do and who they are, what they do with their bodies, what they do with their lives. So that was just something that came to mind.
All right, thank you. I hope that you stay around for John's presentation on common grace, because, in the teaching time, because it used to be the idea that the common grace of God is what gave life and power and meaning to the rest of the world. But if you get away from the idea that it's God's grace that goes well beyond this assembly here and well beyond your family, once you believe that, then God gets the proper glory. But you know what happens? What's going on now? It's the assembly and Jesus and God are the problem. And the common grace is now being ascribed to science and the state. And they're the ones that are handing out the gracious goodies. Paul will have none of it. Paul sees all the goodness is coming from Christ. No other source. And that goodness is going everywhere. No stopping it. Another question. The microphone situation is not deterring the bold this morning.
Though it is funny that if I sat there and asked it, there would be no butterflies in my stomach. And with the, but you hit two things that I have firmly believed for a long time and probably taught, and so I need to just ask you about them. One is that a preacher, teacher would not be held, that it's considered a higher standard, but doesn't James say not many of you should be teachers because you will be held to a stricter standard? Yeah. And the other one is, this is probably more subtle and it may be more in our depth of faith in this, but I do hold heaven out as a hope, as a, I'm not saying I want to go there tomorrow to escape this, but when things get hard here, to me it's an encouraging thing that God gives us to know that we won't always have to deal with this.
Right. Let me deal with the second question first, if I may. I believe what Paul's teaching here in 1 Corinthians 15 is, yes, heaven is our hope. But the ultimate hope that I think he's talking about here is not that we get to escape these bodies, but that we actually get to live in these bodies as a resurrected body. That's the end of this thing here.
But that's still as a resurrected body.
Yeah, in that case. But see, the intermediate state, which Paul doesn't really talk about much, but theologians talk about all the time, what happens between the time of the resurrection and now is what we often get talked about here. It's like we just got to get out of this body, if you will, got to get out of the sinful world, and then we're going to be good to go. And Paul is, I think, ultimately saying, actually, don't be that all concerned about getting out of your body, because this body is definitely going to be resurrected. And I would argue that our idea of getting away from this physical world into the spiritual heaven, and that's our ultimate goal, is definitely left over from Greek dualism and Marcion. It's coming down through the years, and it's definitely seeped in the church. This idea that those people who work with their hands, if you will, that aren't doing the spiritual things, are just not quite up on the same level. Which brings me to your second question. James does say that. He says, "My brother, be not many teachers, knowing that we'll receive the greater judgment." To me, greater judgment does not necessarily equate to higher calling. Whatever you mean by higher calling, I heard that as a young person. It's a higher calling. What do you mean by higher calling? Higher than what? Because if you have a higher calling, then you have a lower calling. Paul says, "I have become all things to all men," and Paul really served. Is that a higher calling or a lower calling? I don't even know what it is. It sounds almost lower to me. Yeah, but he says, I've learned how to serve people. Of course, Christ saying that these people that have this hierarchy, the Gentiles, they lord the authority over each other, but it's not going to be that way among you guys. You guys learn how to serve each other, which of course they all did. So I'm definitely not getting away from the idea of a stricter judgment. That's true. But I think the idea of the stricter judgment there has to do with what God said to the Old Testament prophets at times. You make sure you get my word correct. That judgment, if you will, was not on everybody in the same way. So the stricter judgment to me does not necessarily have to do with a higher calling, whatever that is. Whatever that is. Yeah, I think it's going to get more questions out of the microphone, not less.
So, how do passages, like I was reading in Zephaniah this morning, about creation being burned with fire, and then in the footnotes that refer to 2 Peter, and just that concept of creation being burned, how does that relate to your sermon this morning?
Yeah, I thought I was going to get that question. And my answer is not a good one. It's going to be a bad answer, Jeremiah. I'm trying to work my way through that. I'm trying to work my way through the idea of the restoration of the creation versus the destruction of the creation, being burned up. The whole thing gets burned up. I haven't yet been able to work my way through that. There are some theologians that I'm looking at now who believe that that's speaking, shall we say, metaphysically, that the fire there is actually the ongoing judgment of Christ throughout history, if you will, and it is that transforms the world. That's definitely not what I've been taught. My guess is most of us have not been taught that. We've been taught that there's a time coming when the whole world just burns up. It's just a huge fireball. We're not going to be on it, but we'll be able to see it. So that is something I'm still working through, because the Bible definitely talks about the restoration of the creation. It gets restored. And to Jeremiah's point, if the creation gets restored, why would you burn it up, right? Throughout the Bible, you burn things that are no good anymore, right? Christ talking in John 15 about the branches that are no good, they're cut down and burnt. So I'm still working my way through that one. I know the Bible teaches a restored creation, and it teaches a restored body. The whole burning thing, it's definitely there. It definitely teaches that. It's what does it mean? I'm still working my way through that. And I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you. That's a good question. It's a really great question that I don't have an answer for it. But it should be asked. It should be. Who else has a question? By the way, how's the sound for everybody? Sound good for everybody? Good. Yes.
So I was just looking at the passage in 1 Corinthians, specifically verse 44, says, "It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body." There's a natural body and there's a spiritual body. Just on the surface, that seems to be saying the opposite of what you're saying.
Yeah.
Like, we have a natural body now, but we're going to have a spiritual body later, not a natural body. So, and it seems to say that a lot throughout
Right.
the passage. So,
Yes,
could you comment on that?
46, yeah, however, the spiritual is not first, but the natural, and afterward the spiritual. Okay. I think the key to that passage, Conrad, is actually in verse 45, which is kind of like right in the middle of this. You talk about what Conrad was talking about. Start in verse 43 of chapter 15. Well, actually verse 44. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. There's a natural body and there is a spiritual body. I think Conrad's point there is, that's opposite what you've been saying. How in the world do you sow the natural seed, like Paul's saying earlier, and it graduates into a spiritual body? And then verse 46, however, the spiritual is not first, but the natural, and afterward the spiritual. So what do we do with this? I think the answer here is in the definition of what is spiritual. I'm going to ask us to step away from our normal idea of what is spiritual, because normally spiritual means non-physical, right? That's what he's a spiritual man. He operates in the realm of the spirit. He doesn't operate in the realm of the physical where we live. And I think, and here's where I get that. Verse 45, in the middle of this, I think defines it for us. And so it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. So I think when he's talking about the spiritual there, he's talking about the ability, all the goodness of the body that was originally supposed to be had, that is given to us by the life-giving spirit. It's not talking about spiritual as non-material. It's talking about spiritual as that which Christ gives us because of his resurrection. And I get that also from verse 47. The first man was of the earth, made of dust. The second man is the Lord from heaven. Well, the second man is the Lord from heaven, and he was spiritual, but he was physical as well. He was not, it wasn't like, again, you reach right through him. So I believe it's our definition of spiritual here that will help us understand the passage. Verse 49, a little further. Thank you, John. As we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the man of the heavenly man. The heavenly man, not heavenly spirit, right? But the heavenly man is spiritual. Yep. Yeah, John said the spiritual image. I think that's what that's talking about. It's our definition of spiritual here that is we need to challenge. All right, well, I certainly want to thank you for your kind attention here this morning. I see the value of closing on time because then we get the questions answered on time. So I'll try to do better in the future. I'm not saying how hard I'll try, but I will try.